Vitalis, New Beginnings, Part 2, by Jason Halstead. Copyright 2024. Chapter 9.
Kira knew Eric was following her down the stairwell towards the airlock, but she didn't wait. It was exciting and terrifying, but she knew what she had to do. She burst through the open hatchway into the passage and threw herself into the far wall. She felt the heat of a passing energy weapon blast, and it brought the reality of the situation to her. She'd already seen several of the invaders through the open door to the airlock, one on the inner side of the door, two on the outer side, and a fourth kneeling further back in the middle. She had also seen the twitching leg of a fifth on the ground. Tarn was kneeling behind an open panel that he'd removed from the wall. He was also sporting multiple scorch marks on his clothes. The panel glowed where the raiders' energy weapons had struck it. Captain Sharp stood in another hatch, trying to angle for a shot. She could see the captain was being driven back each time he moved. Kira threw herself forward, springing off the wall and crashing on the floor in the middle of the passage. Her rifle was held ready for the moment she stopped moving. She pulled the trigger mechanically and jammed her right hand and right knee into the floor. When next she came to rest, she was kneeling with her left hand on the deck and her right knee spread wide for balance. She sensed more than felt the beams from the pirate's lasers that missed her spinning form. She held her breath long enough to send another high-density magnetic sliver at supersonic speeds through the faceplate and head of the pirate that stood on the right side of the hatch. Then she dove forward into a roll. She felt the heat along her buttock and thigh from a highly focused light beam that grazed her. The suit fragmented and dispersed the energy, causing discomfort but not injury. A cry behind her proved far more distracting. She risked a glance back. Her only fear was that Eric had been hurt. She saw him clutching his forearm and scrambling backwards. Another shot hit her, this time squarely in the side beneath her left arm. Her bodysuit prevented it from burning through, but the heat blistered her flesh beneath the second skin. With teeth clenched, Kira fired a round blindly and then let her mind go enough to drop supine to the deck. Her rifle hummed as the magnetic rails in the barrel sent a round into the crouching invader on the left side of the airlock door. It hit him high on the left side of the chest, near the shoulder, but the spray that coated the wall of the airlock behind him and the way he spun away from the impact gave proof that he was out of the fight. With only one visible attacker left, Kira knew what her next move should be. She gathered her legs in preparation to spring, and then noticed the spherical ball that was only now slowing its roll toward her. It had just passed Tarn, leaving it half a dozen feet behind Captain Sharp. With less than 10 feet until it reached her, she drove her hands into the deck. The concussive blast from the grenade swept over her, knocking her off balance and leaving her disoriented. It was an LF grenade, or low frequency, which let loose a powerful subsonic blast that was great for disorienting people and damaging delicate electronics. She tried to make sense of how the floor and the ceiling seemed interchangeable, fighting back a wave of nausea at the same time. The remaining pirate held his position while 5 others rushed past him and down the passage. Tarn was slumped against the wall, the steel panel resting on him. Captain Sharp was rolling on the ground, trying to find his feet much the same as Kira. She rolled onto her back, clamping down on her lips to prevent her stomach from emptying. She tasted the bile and screwed her eyes shut. When she opened them, she saw one of the men pointing their laser rifles at her. Their weapons had been modified, she noticed instantly. Without knowing how she understood, the bulky modifications amplified the power considerably. As a trade-off, she estimated the guns had to cool longer between shots, or, if ignored, would shut down to prevent damage. That or the pirates went through a lot of weapons. Tarn and Sharp were also being covered, though Tarn was only beginning to show signs of coming out of the grenade-induced stupor. The 4th boarder walked up to Kira and chuckled when he saw her rifle laying in the passage. Well, what have we here?" he said. He'd opened up the external speakers on his suit to allow his voice to be heard. The man guarding her turned to look at the other pirate as he bent down to pick up her rifle. Kira realized that if any life lay ahead of her, it would be short at best, or long, and filled with pain and suffering. Her body wanted to act now that the dizziness was fading. She was terrified of having another one of her blackouts, but living through what was about to happen scared her more.
One last time,
She thought to herself. She was surprised at the thought and the fact that she wasn't sure it had even come from her. Kira let out her breath and fell back within herself. She watched, almost as though she was staring at a display screen, as her body spun on the floor, so her legs were between the man standing above her. She scissored her legs open, hitting his at the ankles and sending them flying. He fell, so surprised he barely had the time to yelp. He slammed into the deck roughly. Kira, or her body at least, sat upright and grabbed the laser rifle from his hands. She lay back down and planted both feet on him and then propelled herself across the floor, even as she sent him rolling into the pirate that was rising with her magnetic acceleration rifle she'd dropped. As she slid, she oriented the laser and fired, burning through the soft portion of the pirate's suit at his neck and making him lurch backwards. Off balance, he crashed to the floor. Kira felt another wave of nausea hit her as her body flipped up into the air, driven by a powerful convulsion of her back and legs. Then she was on her feet and running forward. Distantly, she smelled scorched hair, and she knew her head had been narrowly missed. Another beam struck her in the chest, burning her badly and charring her bodysuit with the direct hit. She fired her laser with one hand, puncturing the suit of the pirate that stood near Tarn, but doing no damage. He pulled himself back into a crouch, an instinctive reaction that Kira suspected whoever was controlling her body had expected. Her free hand grabbed her own rifle from the wounded pirate, which she fired point-blank into his chest. Spacesuits were designed to be radiation and energy resistant. Against a sharpened ballistic projectile traveling close to 3,000 feet per second, they were no better than paper. He collapsed onto the deck, gasping for breath, and clawing at the hole in his suit over the hole in his chest. Another beam staggered Kira, this one warming her thigh. It had come from the pirate in the airlock that had remained to cover the others. She gestured at him with the uncharged laser rifle, making him duck behind the wall. The beauty of beam weapons was that they fired at the speed of light and the beams themselves were invisible to the human eye. Calling her bluff would have been a very dangerous gamble. Even with that threat momentarily averted, Kira had no idea how she was going to survive. The man near the senseless Tarn was a heartbeat from firing at her. The man who had slipped through the hatch to cover Captain Sharp had stuck just enough of his body out to fire at her. She winced internally, preparing to be consumed in a painful, fiery death.
the wall.
The same voice inside her said,
Jump to it, spring off it, and put a round through the man ahead of you. Then use the laser to deal with the man in the hatch.
Kira stumbled and realized her body was her own again. Her stumble saved her, based upon the curse she heard from the pirate in the hatch. She lurched forward, knowing she only had a few feet to go. The laser rifle throbbed in her hand, a feedback control in the grip notifying her that the capacitors had recharged. She leapt to the side, dodging the beam from the man ahead of her, and then planted her foot on the side of the passage as instructed and boosted herself higher into the air so that she had a better angle at him over Tarn's slumped figure. She fired and felt a jolt of exhilaration flare through her as he fell back to the floor and fed a growing pool of red liquid. Then her head hit the ceiling of the passage. She hadn't considered what the extra boost might give to her already impressive height. She fell down, crashing to one knee, and struggled against the pain that threatened to tip her over. She struggled up while the remaining nearby pirate shouted something at her. She failed to make it out, so intent was she on her own course of action. She felt her right arm on fire, even as it swung the laser towards him. The rifle broke in half as it hit him, but so too did the viewport on his suit crack. The pressurized suit hissed as air escaped from it, and the pirate fell back, stunned by the physical assault. She fell on top of him, reversing her broken laser rifle and jamming it into his body time and again until she was certain he was no longer a threat. The sharpened fragments had pierced both suit and skin many times.
One left.
She whispered to herself without looking at the persistent pain in her upper arm. She dropped the broken laser rifle and considered picking up the pirates. She left it, realizing her own Toledo Systems MAR-7 was weapon enough. She smirked at the understanding that she knew the exact model number and specifications of her rifle. She wondered what else she knew, and then discarded the thought. If this worked out right, she would have more than enough time to have a long talk with herself. Kira dove through the hatch and tucked into a roll that left her feeling freshly bruised. She dimly heard Captain Sharp blurt something out behind her, but she ignored him. Killing the last of the pirate boarding party was all that mattered. There had been 9 sensor contacts, and 8 of them were now down. Ignoring the pain, she pushed herself off the wall and rolled up onto her feet. She jumped ahead, each leg alternately driving into the decking to propel her into a different place as she closed on the airlock. She screamed in denial when she saw the door close ahead of her, spurring her to run faster. The door shut before she could reach it, though only by the barest margin. She crashed into it and beat her fists against it angrily. The green light cycled to red, indicating it was being depressurized. And then she felt as much as heard the machinery in the ship's hull open the outer door to let the pirate escape. Nearly 3 minutes later, the light cycled back to green and the door opened. Kira stood ready, rifle held at her shoulder and her own body crouched into a shooter's stance. Inside the airlock, a mess awaited her. All 4 of the dead pirates had suffered varying degrees of explosive decompression. Blood, brain, and other tissue coated the walls, floor, and even ceiling. Kira's eyes swept over it without feeling, and then she swore and stood up slowly.
Emily.
Kira turned to the source of the voice. Captain Sharp stood in the hatchway, plasma rifle in hand, though he still looked unsteady. Tarn was watching from where he'd gathered himself against the wall. His rifle lay across his lap and a small pile of vomit lay beside him. The name Emily had come from further down the passage, where Eric was walking slowly towards her. The engineer still cradled his arm where he'd been shot. Her eyes fell on the first man she'd assaulted, realizing she hadn't finished him. Somebody else had taken care of that for her, someone with a plasma rifle, from the extent of the injuries to the body.
What? Who's Emily?
She pulled herself away from the vision of the burned corpse. Something about the name seemed familiar to her. It was a pretty name, the same name she'd once called an imaginary friend she'd invented after her parents had died. Emily had helped her get through her grief and the horrible times that followed. Then one day, she stopped thinking about her. It was as though she didn't need her anymore.
Kira?
What, Eric? They're all dead except the one that got away. He'll either be back with reinforcements, or they'll just start blowing holes in the ship.
Kira turned to look back into the airlock. The macabre scene broke through her state of shocked calm, making her gasp. She stumbled back, her hand going to her mouth, and then she stumbled on something and fell on her butt. Kira looked over and saw she'd tripped on the foot of one of the pirates she had killed. She let out a yelp and scrambled away, putting her hand solidly into the puddle of blood from the dead pirate near Tarn. She gasped again and lurched away, climbing to her feet and looking for a place to run. "I killed them," she stammered through trembling lips. Tarn chuckled before saying,
"You kicked their ass between their shoulders and hit them so hard their grandparents felt it."
Kira looked at him as he wiped spittle from his lips. He grinned and gave her a thumbs up. Kira felt her stomach twist, and this time she knew it would not be denied. She turned and felt it explode out of her, sending her to her knees as powerful convulsions threatened to tear her insides apart.
Chapter 10.
Kira opened her eyes and found that she was lying in the bunk room. On her own bunk, no less. She looked around and found it deserted. She frowned, trying to figure out what was going on. She didn't remember lying down to sleep. Her arm ached, prompting her to look at it. It had been bandaged. Her chest and a few other body parts hurt as well. She picked up the sheet and looked beneath it, gasping when she saw another bandage on her chest. She threw the blanket down the bed and sat up. She was nude, aside from a collection of bandages. Another blackout? She groaned and swung her legs over the edge of the bed. At least she was still on the rented mule. Laying on the bedside stand was a torn-up and otherwise abused piece of cloth. It was stretched out fully, showing her the extent of the damage to it. The chest was blackened, and the right upper arm had a hole with the edges of the fabric melted and charred. Rips and scorch marks marred the fabric, but where it was whole, it had a sheen to it that sparked her memory. Kira gasped as it came back to her. The pirates, the sniper rifle, the voice she had heard, and the name Emily. "What have I done?" she whispered to herself. She stood up on shaky legs. Her body ached, causing her to move slowly and stiffly across the room to a mirror. The bunk room was communal, a necessity of limited crew space aboard the transport vessel. Yet she was the only one in it. She stared at her reflection, noting the bruises in the early stages of showing color, as well as the edges of burn marks that appeared beneath some of her bandages.
I killed 7 men.
She watched as her chin trembled at the memory of it. "Knock it off! It's not like it's the first time." Kira gasped, her grief forgotten. She spun around, but with her body stiff and aching. She made it worse by falling to the cool steel floor. She craned her neck, looking all around the room, but saw nothing. She climbed back to her feet slowly, groaning at the pain in her burned leg and bruised back. She glanced into the mirror again, with only a flicker of interest, and felt her heart leap into her throat. She spun again, looking behind her, but saw nothing. Back in the mirror, she saw a silhouette of a figure that seemed shrouded in shadow. It stood still, facing her back.
Emily.
You did well today, Kira. I'm proud of you. All the time and money I spent seems to have paid off.
Kira's hand flew to her mouth, muffling her gasp.
You're not real. I made you up as a kid.
The shadowed figure stepped forward slowly. The shadows began to lighten as though she was coming into the light.
I'm as real as you are, Kira. You sent me away, but I wasn't ready to go. After all we'd shared, all the help I'd given you.
Kira realized she was nodding.
I really am crazy.
The figure shrugged.
I hated you, you know. I wanted to hurt you for what you did to me. You sent me away after you were the only person who ever cared for me. But I couldn't. If I hurt you, I'd hurt myself.
I'm sorry.
I know you are. You weren't ready. I know that now. I've gotten tired of my life, Kira. Of our life. It was only half a life, and it wasn't the fun part. You've never had the good part either. I kept it from you. That's not fair, and I understand that. I want you to be whole again, Kira. I want you to live, and to do everything you should do. I even like Eric, not as much as you, but I've only talked to him once.
Kira gasped. She remembered hearing Eric call Emily's name in the passage before she had blacked out. No, not blacked out, she'd passed out. She understood that now. Emily stepped closer, the shadows fading from her face, to reveal to Kira that she was staring at 2 images of herself in the mirror. One, the real one, in front of the mirror, and the other just slightly behind her and to her left. She felt her chin trembling again.
Be strong, Kira. You wouldn't believe the things we've done over the years. 8 pirates was impressive, but we've pushed the line even further before. Now it's all about you. There's no tie to the money or to Kira Eskew, only Emily Bradford. My time is over. Yours is just beginning. Live for us, Kira. Do all the things I could never do.
Kira felt the tears run down her cheeks. She nodded, both fearful and excited at the prospects ahead of her.
I won't wake up and find Eric missing.
Eric might need you more than you need him. Now stop talking to yourself. It makes you look crazy.
Kira laughed at the joke. She wanted to turn, but she knew it would do her no good. She watched instead as Emily stepped to her right, hiding completely behind Kira. She gasped, feeling something inside of her mind release. Millions of images and thoughts flashed through her conscious mind in a heartbeat, unrecognizable but now a part of her. Kira refocused on the mirror and then reached up to wipe the tears from her face. She felt different, she realized. She no longer felt lost and inadequate. Kira turned, shaking her head slightly at the incredible weirdness of it, and then made her way back to her bed. She picked up the torn and burnt bodysuit and considered it. She glanced at her locker, where she had other clothes available, and then smiled as she slipped the bodysuit back on. She made sure it covered the most important areas, and then moved at a stiff but deliberate pace to the bridge, where she expected to find somebody, if not all of them. She was in luck. Eric, Tarn, Captain Sharp, and Jeff were gathered when she stepped into the hatchway. They fell silent instantly, staring at her with mixed expressions. Kira addressed Captain Sharp first.
Do you have my rifle?
Here.
Tarn turned and, picking up her MAR-7 from his station behind him, she noted he sported multiple bandages as well and had a steel rod with a crosspiece at the top to use as a cane. She took it from him and glanced at the cane deliberately.
That LF grenade went off next to me. Shrapnel tore into my hip pretty good.
Kira nodded and then began to turn away from him. She saw that Eric's face was guarded. He met her eyes briefly and then looked away before she could offer him a smile.
Hey, that's an impressive piece of hardware you got there. Newer than what I'm used to. Then again, I never cared much for sniping. You got clearance for that thing.
Clearance? She glanced down at it, clueless as to how to answer him.
Does it matter?
Only if somebody with bigger guns and a search order comes asking.
An image of herself filling out forms at an office and then transferring money from 3 separate accounts to a 4th account played through her head.
Yes, I have a security clearance for it.
He nodded and looked away from her. Kira frowned. He hadn't been nodding to her. It had been for the captain. She turned to face him.
This going to be a problem?
Problem. Maybe you hit your head, but you just saved our butts. Near as we can tell, the pirates turned tail and ran away. Eric even went out on the hull to see about some repairs. No sign of him. You can sail with me anytime, navigator or security.
Hey,
Shut your hole, Tarn, you're old and not much to look at. Kira here is younger, faster, and a lot nicer to look at.
Tarn chuckled.
got me there.
Kira looked back and forth between them.
Aren't you the least bit curious about how I did all that?
Ain't a one of us that doesn't have secrets. A dark past, a mistake or a string of them. We wouldn't be where we was without them. Long as they don't threaten my ship or my crew, you're entitled to them. One thing though, is it Kira or is it Emily?
Eric made a strangled sound at Sharp's words, drawing glances from Kira and the captain.
It's Kira. Emily I don't know what she was. A survival mechanism, I suppose. She's gone now, and I have to pick up the pieces and move on with my life.
Kira paused to stare purposefully at Eric.
If my life will let me, that is.
Eric met her gaze, and after a long couple of seconds, he gave her an abbreviated nod. The butterflies in her stomach settled down, but it took a few additional moments for her to tame the grin that came to her face. She turned back to the captain.
I don't even know all the skills I have, nor what's so special about me. It's going to take a lot of time to figure out.
She paused, thinking about where to begin or what to say. She looked at all of them and noticed for the first time the absence of Kevin.
Hey, where's Kevin?
Jeff stiffened and looked away.
He didn't make it.
Pirates picked him off the hull on their way in. Jeff was hiding on the other side. They never saw him.
Oh. I'm sorry.
She really was sorry, but in spite of having spent months on the same ship with the man, she had never really gotten to know him. That and her natural compassion and empathy seemed diminished for some reason. She frowned, wondering if Emily was responsible for that dehumanizing trait. Not for the first time, she wondered just what Emily had done while she was blacked out.
Okay, let's move on. What's next? How's the mule doing?
Engines are good, but the pushers are shot up. I can probably get some minimal thrust out of one of them. They took another shot at us after they left. A parting gift.
We were just discussing that very thing. Unless you've got any more revelations for us.
Kira shook her head and then moved over to sit down at the navigator station. She noted that the seat had been adjusted to give her knees more clearance. She smiled and blinked away the sudden moisture that came to her eyes. Even uncertain of their future, Eric had still been thoughtful enough to help her. She pushed the thought aside. There'd be time to thank him properly and messily later. She checked her rifle over, noting it still possessed 3 rounds in the clip. She wondered if the case it had been packed in had any more. She turned and saw them all still watching her. She stuck her tongue out at them and put the MAR-7 down, and then pressed her data port against that of the nav station. Moments later, she was reading data on her display and mentally injecting commands back into it faster than she could ever remember doing. New commands came to mind as well, slipping in with the old ones and allowing her to bypass just the navigational systems she normally accessed and giving her free rein of the ship's computer. She smirked, wondering how upset Sharp would be if she routed the output of the display to the main terminal instead of just her own private one. As she sorted through the different sections she now had available, she stumbled across the cargo load. She surveyed it, feeling something nagging at the back of her head.
Hey.
She drew the attention of the others while she continued to survey it.
When we lost our sensors, what happened?
Energy blast. Probably a charged particle beam. Too far for a plasma or a laser.
She glanced at him, nibbling on her lip.
You said something at the time. Something about our sensors being useless even before.
Yeah, theirs was.
Kira scowled at him.
What did you say?
That they're junk.
Don't make me slap you. I don't mean just now, I mean when it happened.
Tarn shrugged.
That was weeks ago.
Kira closed her eyes and thought back. She'd found the enemy ship, but it was at extreme range still. Sharp was worried what kind of weapons the pirates had. She gasped. Suddenly it flashed into her head as clear as if she had just heard it.
I remember. You said this is a transport. No sensors worth a damn on here. Mining rigs got better eyesight than this thing does.
Yeah, sounds right.
It is right, it's exactly right.
Kira turned back to study the inventory list again.
Captain, we can float blind forever, or you can break into our cargo and rig up some eyes for us out of the mining gear we've got. There's some small scout craft we're carrying that have them on them. Perhaps even hook them up in an array for greater detail.
She looked up at the open-mouthed faces of the rest of the crew. Eric stared with an open mouth until he realized it.
That's brilliant.
Sharp slapped his chair and laughed, and then he hopped up and went over to Kira's station, giving her a resounding smack right on her lips. She let out a surprised yelp and pushed him back, but he just gave her a wink.
Captain's prerogative. Don't worry, I won't tell Eric.
What?
Tarn, suit up, you and Eric got some work to do. Jeff, start clearing off the old sensors. We may be limping and we may not have much hope, but by the stars out there, we're going to know where we are.
Chapter 11.
Close to 30 hours later, Eric's disembodied voice came across the ship's speakers.
We've made the last connections. Some calibration may be necessary since we're running in tandem, but we'll deal with that when it's needed. Energizing the array in 3, 2, 1.
Kira slipped in streams of commands into her station. Text scrolled across her screen and then blinked out for half a second. When it returned, it was sectioned off into windows, one containing her text stream while 2 others had graphical displays. Kira hissed triumphantly and then continued to instruct the computer to bring the new sensor arrays online. Within moments, the main display came back to life, rendering a simulated image rather than the direct optical feed of the space outside of the Rented Mule. Captain Sharp threw his fist in the air and let loose a whoop.
Keep your hands to yourself.
Eric warned over the speakers. Sharp and Kira both laughed, remembering the last time Kira did something Sharp was pleased with.
All right, so where are we?
Kira focused on her display as she worked the controls and tried to zero in on their location. She frowned, not making sense of what her system told her.
I'm not sure. We're traveling just under half the speed of light.
What?
Yes, sir, 0.45 of C. A lot of this doesn't make sense. I can't even figure out our course or where we came from. Something must have happened during the FI.
What's wrong?
Sharp demanded after Kira fell silent. She held up a finger on her free hand, which only served Sharp to hop out of his chair and come and lean over her shoulder. She glanced up at him, conveying her annoyance with her pinched eyebrows.
The mule doesn't have any inertial compensators.
It's a damned old transport. We're lucky it's got engines.
Yeah, well, without those and with inertial suppression on the inside of the ship, we've got no idea when our course is altered without active sensors. The first battle, with all of those impacts from the raider, must have skewed our heading, probably our pitch as well, if not the other axis.
So what? We're lost in space.
No, well, yes, but only until I have time to figure things out. We're going faster than we thought. We didn't expect to hit anything over 0.15 C. I bet nobody bothered checking either because of that, but now that I'm looking at it, yes, see, our fuel reserves for the pushers are at 10%. We were supposed to make the run to the mining station and back and still have 40% left.
Sharp swore and turned to stomp back to his seat.
Captain, it doesn't really matter how much fuel we have for the pushers. We've only got one that I can squeak anything out of, and it would take close to 60 years to slow down, turn around, or do anything else.
What happened? Why the extra speed? Why the extra fuel?
Does it matter?
Kira turned to look at Tarn. He held up his hands, showing that her glare was similar to the captain's.
Hey, don't be looking at me like that. It don't matter what happened, it happened. Now we got to figure out what we're going to do about it. More time we waste not doing that, the more fucked we are.
Kira felt her eyes narrow as she eyed him suspiciously. He was right, but why draw attention away from figuring out what happened if not to hide something? She turned back to her station, suddenly taken with an idea prompted by Tarn's suggestion.
Got it.
Kira cried out a minute later.
I couldn't pinpoint us because I wasn't using the right dimensions.
Dimensions. We hit a wormhole or something.
Kira shook her head.
No, sorry, I meant X, Y, Z, and time. I hadn't factored in that we might not be in the time we think we should be.
I'm waiting for this to make sense, and I have to say, I'm not in the mood for being played with.
Yes, Captain, no games, sir. When the sensors were hit, it sent all sorts of feedback into our system that messed with the ship's core computers. Our 4-week sleep was closer to 12 months.
Sharp groaned and slumped in his chair after a long moment of staring at Kira with an open mouth. Tarn was quicker to react, blurting out,
Them pirates followed us for a year.
I don't know, maybe. I think they were probably after somebody else though.
Who would be this far out?
No idea, sir, but more importantly, we missed the asteroid belt by about 11 months. It's damn near a light year away from us, but we didn't just shoot past it, we also were pitched up about 5 degrees. Although the recent fight skewed us some more.
So where are we headed?
Out there, sir. Deep space. Deeper, we're already outside the rim.
The silence on the bridge was agonizing until, after a pregnant pause, Captain Sharp exhaled softly.
How are our maneuvering reserves?
Kira called up another display on the main screen.
70%, sir.
She turned to look at him, not sure what else she could or should do. He nodded as he looked at it, and then stood up slowly.
Do we have broadcast ability?
Yes, Captain.
Eric said over the speakers. Kira noted his voice sounded subdued, and then again, she supposed not a one of them sounded the best. Their situation had passed desperate a while ago. Now even bleak was an optimistic description.
Radio signal or direct transmission.
I'll be in my room.
Sharp announced. He paused, looking at both Kira and Tarn alternately.
If either of you have anything you want to say to anyone left behind, I suggest you figure it out now.
Sharp left the two of them with that somber thought. Kira looked at Tarn and found her vision skewed by unshed tears. She blinked them away and took a deep breath that had potential to turn into a sob. She kept it controlled and offered the ex-Marine a faint smile.
Ex-Marine.
Yup. Discharged for a little misunderstanding with some terrorists that took over a space station.
Kira felt the muscles in her back stiffen, even as the new memories flooded through her mind.
Blue Vista's space station.
He nodded.
You used a particle accelerator cannon to blow a hole through the hull. You killed nearly 200 people, most of them civilians.
Tarn shrugged.
Got the job done.
You're a cold-blooded son of a bitch.
Tarn chuckled. The chuckle turned deeper as it went on, until he was laughing at her. Kira glared at him, ready to rise out of her seat and shut him up forcefully. She refrained, either from a sense of curiosity or futility. They were all doomed, she figured. Why not get her questions answered, instead of just putting her foot through his teeth?
Wasn't no warm and fuzzy girl that put down 7 pirates.
Tarn pointed out.
Don't know what you done, but I reckon you and I got something in common. And I'm not talking about lusting for that engineer's horse dick neither.
I lost a friend on Blue Vistas. A civilian that got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, and you spaced her.
Kira stared at him, feeling a sense of calm that scared her. It came from deep within her, and, she suspected, it was a leftover from Emily. The friend she mentioned was a friend of Emily's, or at least as close to a friend as her alter ego had ever had. Kira had never known her or known of her, but now she could see her faintly freckled pale face with a startling clarity. Her name had been Angela, but Emily had called her Angel. Especially when Kira's hand went to her mouth to hide her gasp. Tarn frowned.
What? You was looking like you was about to shoot me. Now this.
She was more than a friend.
She was shocked. She'd never known. Never felt more than a passing appreciation of another woman. But Emily, she wondered if there had been any others.
Oh, sorry. Older I get, smaller the universe ends up being. You want some payback? You come and get it. Maybe I'm old and fat and out of shape, but I still got what they put in me. Might be a good way to go better than waiting for us to run out of food or die in my sleep.
I'm not going to kill you.
Kira put the memories of Emily's long-lost friend away. That had been over 16 years ago, she realized. 17 now, considering their prolonged sleep.
I think you're kind of a loser, but my social options are limited.
I'll drink to that.
Kira spared him a withering glare, and turned back to her station. With nothing else to do but wait for the end to come, she decided she might as well figure out what their future held.
Chapter 12.
Each member of the Rented Mule's crew recorded their messages privately. When it came Kira's turn, she realized she had no one left behind her. No family and no friends. She'd only had herself, and though she'd searched her memory long and hard, she could only find one resemblance of a relationship, and that had been to Angela. Emily had enjoyed a few trysts here and there with men. Kira was happy to remember, but that was the end of it. Instead, she rattled off instructions to have her various accounts, over a dozen of them, donated to charitable organizations that specialized in helping to provide aid and assistance to troubled children. With that finished, the crew gathered on the bridge to plan what would become of the rest of their lives. It was a somber meeting, with none of them saying much. Eric stood next to her station, but they did not reach for one another. Kira longed for the comfort of human touch, but she thought it would be cruel to the rest of the crew. They had no one to turn to for solace.
All right, with any luck our messages will be received in a year or so. We are broadcasting a distress signal, but we are also stuck traveling away from help faster than most ships would risk going. A military vessel is our only hope for a quick recovery, and by quick I mean about 3 years.
Sharp looked around the bridge at his crew. He sighed and shook his head.
You're a sorry lot of cast-offs from society, but I guess I can't think of anyone better to fly into the great unknown with. Well, that's not true. Maybe some gene-bred triplets trained by a courtesan service might be a little more enjoyable.
Sir,
Kira spoke up after giving everyone a chance to pretend they were amused by the captain's joke.
I've been studying the new readings our sensors are pulling in. It's light years away still, but there's a star close by. The other charts don't make mention of it, but that could be because of the angle we're at. It looks like there's a particularly dense asteroid belt ringing the system.
Close by and light years away.
Sharp pointed out her contradictory terms.
Sorry, but yes. It's less than 4 light years from us. That's a little under 8 years.
Then what's?
Kira refused to favor him with even a glance.
Then we see what they've got there. Maybe we can find a planet big enough to hook us in orbit and sling us back around. We might even pick up some speed so that we head back coreward at a faster speed.
Tarn grunted derisively. Sharp stared at the display and then at her, nodding his head as his eyes lost focus. She glanced up at Eric and saw him staring at her with a hint of a smile on his face.
8 years. Another 8 years back.
It's a long shot, sir.
But it's better than anything else we got.
Sharp finished for her.
All right, do what you have to so we can get there. It's not like we're using our fuel for anything else. Then we'll get the ship ready for a deep sleep and go for it. Our engines will run for a couple of 100 years, but that's just energy. We've got the chemicals on hand for a couple of months of food and water, more if we go sparingly, and probably 20 years worth of cold sleep chemicals and nutrients.
You're talking about a deep sleep, not just a few months at a time?
Kira glanced up at him and, in spite of her earlier concerns, reached out to take his hand in hers.
Yeah, and it won't be easy coming out with all of us down, but as long as nothing messes up our computers again, we should be able to do it.
Kira nodded. She felt her heart beat faster in her chest. It excited her to have a plan, to have hope. It was a slim chance, but it was a chance, and that's what mattered.
So what are we waiting for? I'm looking forward to putting another 8 years under my belt.
Can we wait a few hours, at least?
Eric squeezed Kira's hand and then admitted,
Risky stuff, going in deep like that. Just in case anything goes wrong, I'd like to get under her belt, too, if you don't mind.
The others all laughed, causing Kira to blush. Most had the good grace to let it alone, but Tarn added to it,
Sounds good to me. You starting the line?
Kira displayed a small but very wicked-looking knife and said,
Tarn, you can touch me with anything you want, as long as you can get it past this first.
Sharp whistled while Jeff chuckled. Tarn stared at the knife with wide eyes and then grinned. She squeezed Eric's hand to reassure him and then fed the necessary commands into the nav station to steer the ship towards the unnamed system. That finished, she stood up and then gasped as Eric picked her up and tossed her over his shoulder. Catcalls from the rest of the crew made her face burn, but at no point was there any way she could deny the grin that split her lips.
Chapter 13.
The display blinked, shifting from an unpowered darkness to a black non-light that nevertheless revealed shapes in the room. A moment later, colors and lines sprang into existence, casting shadows from the dust-covered stations, chairs, and other objects on the bridge of the Rented Mule. The display quickly coalesced into lines of text. A window displayed the sensor readings collected automatically, indicating the layout of the solar system the Rented Mule was entering. Colored lights sent shadows fleeing their prismatic brilliance in the cold sleep chamber. Chemicals released into controlled intravenous lines, introducing countering agents to the stasis-inducing drugs in their systems. With heartbeats reduced to single digits in the span of a minute, the absorption took the better part of 2 hours before the lights changed again and announced the next stage of the process. Electrodes activated, triggering stimulus to the atrophied muscles of the nearly flatlined sleepers. As the heart rates began to climb into the double digits, basic nutrients and simple sugars filled the IV lines, restoring glucose and energizing the depleted muscles. Once the changes were made, the system resumed a standby state, administering the new changes over a span of several days. When next the lights changed, it was not only to signal the introduction of a gas into the enclosed chambers, but also to engage the overhead lights and raise them to a low level. Intubation tubes, filled with fluids, siphoned as the bodies warmed and returned to life, retracted. A final injection, this one purely synthetic adrenaline, was delivered before the electrodes were triggered with a powerful jolt. Each body convulsed, breath exploding from dry mouths as eyelids opened. The cover of the chambers popped open, hissing as the low pressure maintained internally was equalized. Kira lay in the chamber, unable to see through the blurriness in her aching eyes. Her throat was dry and her chest felt heavy. Each breath was an experience in swallowing razor blades. Kira tried to speak but barely managed a moan. It evolved into a weak attempt at coughing, and that upset her stomach and made her attempt to vomit. With nothing in her stomach, the dry heaves only left her aching and breathless. The only benefit from the process was that the tears watered her eyes enough to make her eyelids feel less like sandpaper. Fighting the agony of muscles long gone unused, Kira forced one arm across, pulling the IV out of one arm and then repeating the action with her other arm. The other necessary connections were removed, albeit slowly, before Kira faced the daunting task of needing to climb out of her chamber.
I can do this.
Kira's pulse, pounding in her ears, nearly drowned her own words out. She reached up to the sides of the chamber and tried to pull herself up. She collapsed, having hardly moved. Fresh tears ran from her eyes, down the sides of her face. Gathering her legs slowly in the cocoon, she reached up and tried again. She managed to pull herself up enough to lean over the edge of the chamber, pinching the flesh in her armpit against the cool metal. The pain helped to focus her and distract her from the exhaustion that made colors dance in her vision. Kira gasped for breath, counting internally until more than a minute had passed, and then she pulled her legs beneath her again and used them to help boost her over the edge. Kira crashed to the cold metal floor. She felt needles and daggers stabbing her body inside and out. The pain was so great, she blacked out for a moment, and then came around with a gasp of air as though she had been drowning. She managed to roll over and lay there, the cool floor stealing what little warmth her body had managed to reclaim. She felt herself shiver, and then she felt the hollow nausea she had come to associate with being so hungry her body was on the verge of malnutrition. Still, she lay on the floor, unable to comprehend the amount of effort it would take to move. Her breathing and heart eventually calmed to the point that she could hear little more than just herself. The faint background hum of the ship's air filtration and recycling service provided her only auditory companion. She steeled herself, feeling sorry for the men trapped still in their tomb-like bunks. They'd once been so strong and filled with life. Now they were shadows of themselves that required machinery to exist. To be reduced to something so powerless was terrifying. She knew that Emily, if she was still around, would be terrified of being in a situation like the one Kira found herself in. For Kira, it was miserable, but she was accustomed to being disadvantaged and without resources. Now she clung to one thing and one thing only: hope. Kira knew now who she was and who she had been. She knew that she had done incredible things, even if she had not been aware of it at the time. Most importantly, she knew that if she could bend her mind to it, she could survive this too. It was with that belief clutched desperately in her heart that Kira rolled onto her stomach and pulled her knees beneath her. She reached out, grabbing the hateful sleep chamber again, and then managed to rise to one shaky leg and then the other. She bent over it, supporting herself with her arms and legs, and tried to will away the nausea and the shakes that threatened to pull her back to the metal floor. Minutes passed before Kira felt the rubber in her legs turn to the electric pins and needles associated with the return of circulation. She realized her jaw was clenched only after the agony began to pass, and her sinuses were burning with the effort of harsh breathing through the dried-out passages. She dared to open her mouth and then slowly turned to look upon the other cold sleep chambers that lay beyond her. To get to them, she would need to walk around hers, a task that seemed no less difficult than swimming the liquid methane oceans of Europa.
One squeeze of the trigger at a time.
She paused, wondering where that expression had come from. It had to be a holdover from something Emily had picked up. She put it aside, realizing she was letting herself be distracted, and began to move around her chamber as carefully as she could. She made it, though her entire body was numb with fatigue, and she felt like blacking out would be a blessing. The next stage for her was in crossing the 6 feet of open space between her cocoon and Jeff's. She gathered her strength and evened her breathing. Kira felt a deep ache in her head and neck, but she pushed it aside. Dehydration and fatigue, she suspected, neither of which would help her crewmates. Kira pushed herself off, moving slowly across the floor. She felt like she was balancing on a wire above a bottomless pit, with each footfall doomed to send her plunging. She gathered speed as she went, her legs burning with the effort, until she crashed into Jeff's cocoon. She held on for dear life, fearing if she slid to the floor she might not get back to her feet. As her heart began to settle, she peered over the clear window, staring down at his shrunken chest and upper stomach. Seeing his body on display, she remembered her own and could not help but glance down at herself. The prolonged stasis had robbed them all of both muscle and fat. Even her breasts, once something she'd taken a small token of pride in, seemed deflated in age. Kira mentally slapped herself.
No more distractions.
She refocused on Jeff and studied both his sleeping body and the displays on the sleep chamber. He was alive but sleeping, the IVs continuing to pump nutrients into his body. She frowned, and then regretted it for the cramp in her neck that ensued. His overall health score was still nearly 30 points from being high enough to initiate the automatic wake-up procedure. That must have meant hers had reached that level. Why then did she feel like she'd been run over by a military-grade space frigate? The ache in her body refused to abate, but the sharper pains faded into a numb background as Kira slowly checked on the rest of the tubes. They were at varying stages of recovery, with Tarn being the next closest to reaching the threshold. She had no idea how long it might take, but he only had 5 more points on the computer-derived scale of wellness remaining. It could mean hours or days, for all she knew. Kira staggered to a couch in the room and lowered herself carefully to it. The padding was thin, and even sitting on it caused a puff of dust to arise. Nevertheless, it felt heavenly to her. Before she knew it, she had slid down further and fell asleep, succumbing to the exhaustion that claimed her. Kira awoke to an insistent chime. She jolted her head up, looking around, and instantly regretted it. Pain blossomed in her mind, a holdover from the condition her body was in, and the residual effects the drugs in her body had caused. She sat up, feeling certain she was going to be sick again, but several deep breaths allowed her to regain control of herself. She glanced around, finding a display and wondering how long she'd slept. She couldn't remember noticing it before she'd fallen asleep, so it could have been minutes or hours. The chime persisted, drawing a breathy groan from her. She warily climbed to her feet, startling herself at how cool the metal floor felt on her naked soles. That had to be a good sign. It meant her core temperature had risen. After a few experimental steps, she found her footing more stable. She glanced back at the closed sleeping tubes of the others, and then nodded to herself. Even if she could wake them up, it would be hours, at best, before they would be able to do anything. More likely days if they felt like she had. She gathered herself together and set off through the ship. It wasn't until she reached the bridge and moved to her station that she realized she had yet to think of putting any clothing on. She shrugged it away. The ship's climate control system had adjusted the temperature to accommodate them before they awoke. The floor might be cool, but at least there was no danger of her freezing. She read the display slowly, refocusing as she grew distracted. Her stomach twisted, as though she needed a reminder that she was at or beyond starvation level hungry.
Soon.
She promised herself, though the simple words exiting her throat made her fear how painful eating would be. Doubling her efforts, she studied the map of the solar system, looking for opportunities. The ring of broken rock that rimmed the system was unusually dense, but not so much that she could not easily plot a course through it. She tested a few routes, judging that the minimal fuel usage would come from making minor corrections in the field, rather than trying to boost the ship above or below the central thickness of it. She put in further instructions into the nav system, causing a slightly longer burn that would put the ship on an intercept course for a planet that preliminary sensor scans showed to be unusual. The modified mining sensors returned strange readings from it, the usual combination of metals and elements, but it also appeared to possess an unusual amount of water. Water in a liquid form, rather than frozen or gaseous. Kira stood up too quickly, one hamstring cramping and her vision tinting dark as the blood failed to rise with her. She barely managed to fall back to her seat, crying out as she did so. She rubbed and stretched her leg, working the cramp out, and then swallowed in an attempt to put out the fiery patch in her throat. More carefully this time, she rose up slowly with her hands on her station. Vertical once more, she let out a faint smile at her triumph, and then turned to head out of the bridge. She paused on the way, her fingers idly resting on the arm of the captain's chair. She glanced around as quickly as her neck allowed, and then sat down in Captain Sharp's chair. She settled into it, an arm on each rest, and then leaned back in it and enjoyed the unfamiliar comfort. From there, she could see the entirety of the bridge, including the displays at each station.
I could get used to this.
She enjoyed another quiet moment of reflection before feeling as though a knife speared through her intestines and twisted into her kidneys. She growled against the pain and rose up slowly.
Fine, I'll feed you,
she said, and hobbled out of the bridge towards the galley. Years of dust and misuse covered everything in the galley. Even coaxing water from the faucet took minutes rather than seconds. The initial water seemed discolored as well, though she knew the ship's automated systems would have stirred the potable water tanks, applying chemicals necessary to purify them. Nonetheless, she let the water cycle for several minutes before she dared to rinse out a cup and then fill it. The feel of the water on her lips was beyond description to her. It was cool, but it stung as it reached into cracks in her lips that she had grown accustomed to. The first bite of stretched and aggravated tissue in her throat soothed with each gentle swallow. It was only through supreme force of will that she stopped herself after only a few small swallows. Just in time, fresh chaos within her stomach made her knees buckle. Only by grabbing onto the counter and slamming her legs into the panel beneath it did she keep from falling. Several minutes of fighting the seemingly shark-skinned monster in her belly passed in what Kira was sure took at least a lifetime. Finally, she was able to pick her head up enough to see that her cup had somehow been thrown across the counter, spilling the precious water within it. The last thing she wanted to see at that point was more water, but she also knew it was exactly what she needed. She gathered another cup, rinsed it out, and then tried to drink again. The results were similar, though not quite as debilitating. If water was that hard to get down, how would she ever be able to stomach the solid food she really needed? Kira fought the tears of desperation that threatened to blind her. She looked around, blinking rapidly and sniffing just as rapidly to keep her nose from running. She was a mess. Why couldn't Eric have woken up before her and taken care of her? Even the captain would have been a welcomed helping hand. Tarn? No, okay, not Tarn. Jeff had given her some hungry looks too, so she didn't think being this weak and alone with him while the others slept was a good idea either. Kira glanced down at her deflated body and almost felt the urge to chuckle. She'd have trouble getting a man who'd spent the last 20 years in prison to find her attractive. She pushed the thought aside and looked around again at the appliances. Her eyes fell on the powdered protein dispenser and then the flavor packets beside it. She glanced back at the sink, wondering how disgusting it would be to try and drink a protein soup. Kira gasped, which caused her throat to constrict in momentary pain. She didn't need a soup, she needed a shake. She turned to another machine and punched in commands on the old-fashioned button-style interface and then poured some protein powder into her empty cup. She grabbed up 2 chocolate flavor packets and, after nipping them with her teeth to help her open them, she dumped them in as well. Moving as quickly as she could, she slipped the cup under the dispenser and waited impatiently for the ready indicator to light up. As soon as it did, she pressed the dispensing button and watched the mixture of hot water and synthetic caffeine pour into her cup. Ignoring the heat, Kira stuck her finger in the cup and started to swirl it around. She hissed after a minute, pulling her scalded finger out and quickly stuck it in her mouth. The flavors burst across her tongue like an explosion, shocking her with their intensity at first, and then making her suck on her finger harder. She realized a moment later what she was doing and managed a snicker at her behavior. She gently blew on the steaming liquid and then sipped it carefully. It burned her lips and tongue, but in spite of that, it tasted delicious. She swallowed carefully, feeling the warmth spreading down her throat and into her belly and soothing her. In spite of her trepidations, her stomach opted to behave this time around. She sipped again, repeating the experience and fighting the urge to guzzle the drink. Kira moved carefully to the table and sat down, holding the cup between her hands and feeling the warmth leaking through it. She drank sparingly, wondering how she could have disliked the taste before. Then again, considering the state her body was in, she would have probably found just about anything organic to taste delicious. She pushed the thought away before her mind could chase it down some of the more disturbing paths it could take. Before she knew it, the cup was empty. She stared into it, wanting more but knowing better. Her stomach felt bloated and uncomfortably full as it was. Her jaw stretched as she yawned, which turned into a grimace as sore tissue was stretched. She climbed to her feet and made her way back to the bridge, this time settling into the captain's chair without a second thought. Kira pressed her data port into the one built into the armrest of the captain's chair. She routed output to the main display instead of the fold-out one that was part of the chair and proceeded to check on her crewmates. Little had changed, aside from nominal increases in the computer-designated health scores. She sighed upon noting that Tarn was still going to be the first to awaken, and then dug deeper into the new solar system. If she truly was the first human to set eyes on it, she wondered if she could name it. She smirked. The Kiran system had a nice ring to it.
Chapter 14.
Captain Sharp, Eric, and Jeff woke up within half an hour of each other. Kira had slipped back into her regular clothing in preparation for Tarn coming around. To spare as much awkwardness as possible, she'd given him a robe to wear after he had emerged from his own chamber. She'd needed to help him get out and put it on, something she remembered with considerable distaste. Another 2 days of nursing him back to health was only slightly lower on her scale of things she hoped to never need to do again. Getting the other 3 up and active was a little easier with Tarn helping her. So much so that she was able to focus on helping Eric with his first meal, the same shake she had made herself what seemed like a lifetime ago.
It's pretty good.
She slid it in front of where he sat at a table. He offered her what she assumed was an attempt at a smile. She smiled in return, remembering all too well how he was feeling.
Don't take this the wrong way, but I'm glad you guys are wiped out.
Kira said after she'd sat next to him and put her arm around him. She could feel how cool his body was even through the robe he wore.
It's not some mothering instinct or anything. I just wouldn't be able to live with myself if you guys didn't feel as bad as I did when I woke up first.
Eric glanced at her at first and then looked back at the cup in front of him. He lifted it carefully, his hands shaking slightly, and took a sip of it. Kira felt her cheeks threatening to split. She was grinning so widely. Eric had raised it again and was drinking as rapidly as his body and the hot liquid would allow.
Careful.
She warned him and gently pulled the cup from him.
Your stomach won't be able to handle it all at once.
A moment later, Eric was drinking again, stopping himself after a few swallows and pacing himself. He glanced at her and tried to smile again, but the obvious pain in the expression brought tears to Kira's eyes. She hugged him close, remembering only at the last minute not to squeeze too hard.
I didn't realize how alone I've been these last couple of weeks.
He stared at her, his eyes clear from fatigue and pain for a brief moment.
Yes, I've been awake for just over 13 days. Tarn's been up for 3. We recovered faster because of the genetic modifications we've had. I'm still not sure what all is in me, and I may never know, but I'm not complaining. Without it, there's no way I could have pulled myself out of my cold sleep tube.
Eric pulled away and stared at her, his lips open, clearly showing the cracks in the dried-out skin. Kira wanted to kiss him, but restrained herself, knowing it would only hurt him more than it would comfort him.
Trust me and get some rest. Don't speak, it only hurts. A few days and you'll be back to normal, especially with Nurse Kira tending to you. And don't get me started about the sponge bath I'm looking forward to giving you after you're feeling better.
She saw his smile turn to a wince. Eric turned back to the drink to finish it, and then let Kira help him up. She led him to the crew quarters and tucked him into his cot, taking special care not to rush him. He fell asleep almost instantly, giving her a few moments to stare at him. Even looking starved and pathetic, she still felt something stirring inside her chest for him. She knelt down next to him and gently kissed him on the temple.
I think I love you.
She confessed, and then quickly stood up and glanced around. Jeff was already asleep a few cots away, and the captain had yet to make his way in. She smiled once more at Eric's sleeping body, and then turned and hurried back to the bridge. Sharp was sitting on his chair, with Tarn standing close enough for Kira to surmise that he had just helped the stubborn man into it.
Captain.
Status.
Sharp grimacing after he spoke from the pain in his throat.
Sir, you should get some rest. We're a week away from our destination and…
What destination?
Kira winced at the resemblance between sandpaper on rocks and the captain's voice.
There's a planet, sir. Sensors are picking up readings I haven't seen anywhere before, aside from Earth, that is.
Earth.
Captain, please. Get some rest.
He glared at her, getting his message across without words. Kira shook her head and sat down.
Fine, but the longer you fight recovery, the longer Tarn's going to try to figure out a way to run this ship.
Her ploy worked, making Sharp's gaze jump over to Tarn. Tarn jerked as well, and then sent a scowl Kira's way.
Captain, I never once.
Sir, there's nothing in this system large enough to slingshot us back towards the core worlds.
Kira interrupted.
Our speed is too great. Given our remaining pusher's status and our fuel level, we won't be able to slow down nearly enough. We need a gas giant. The star is nearly identical to Earth's, only younger. If we had more fuel, we could establish an orbit around it and head back, but with what we have we'd have to veer in too close to it, and the Mule's not built for that level of heat and radiation. We still might make it, but the odds are bad and a single solar flare would end it.
Sharp grunted, and then motioned for Tarn to help him stand. He gained his feet, sweat breaking out on his brow as he did so. Kira felt herself aching for him, knowing the agony he had to be enduring, and the incredible willpower it must have taken for him to function that way.
Get some rest, Captain. I'll figure something out for you by the time you're ready.
He stared at her a long moment. Kira steeled herself, knowing that she had to show him she was confident. She was confident, at least in the area of knowing that she had an idea. It was dangerous, but not as dangerous as trying to use the star's gravity well. It was also probably a permanent solution, but one that she felt she could live with. Kira stayed on the bridge, rerunning her calculations and rechecking her sensor readings. The planet was still 8 days away, plenty of time for the rest of the crew to be back to feeling like human beings again.
Chapter 15.
You want to what?
Kira had braced herself, but the volume and intensity coming from Sharp's outraged question caused his voice to crack. She forced the wince off her face as she met his angry gaze.
Sir, we've been broadcasting for 9 years now. We've got 3 days until we need to make a decision, and that would still put us at 6 days until we reach our destination because we'd be slowing down. 9 days to broadcast a new message, indicating where we are, what we've found, and well, whatever else we've got left.
Why bother? There'll be nothing left of us.
Captain, I've run every possible scenario I can come up with and a few suggested by others. This is the only one that has any chance of success.
We could bypass the system entirely and stay on the ship.
Aye, we could, but at our speed we'd almost certainly stay ahead of any rescuers that attempted to come after us. Sir, with all due respect, I don't want to die marooned on the Rented Mule.
Sharp's eyes narrowed. He waited until Kira realized he was expecting her to go on.
So we rotate the ship and use the pusher to slow us down. Using the last of our reserves, we can get to about a quarter C. That leaves us with only our thrusters, which will produce a lot more immediate thrust but will run out quicker. My simulations show those are best saved for once we enter the atmosphere to help us maneuver and slow us down. The planet has a lot of water, so if we can use the atmosphere and our thrusters for braking, we can land in the water and have a reasonable chance of surviving.
Land. You mean crash?
We'll compromise and call it a crash landing. The engines will be online and the inertial suppressor as well. An impact like that will override it, but by diverting all of our power to it at the last second, it shows a decent chance of not being smeared against the floor. That much power will require the overrides be thrown though, and the inertial suppressor will be destroyed by the overload.
What kind of chances?
Kira felt her heart leap in her chi saint. By asking that question, she knew he was considering it.
Better than 1 in 3, sir. If the timing is right on everything.
Then what? The Mule's not that kind of boat. This ship is rated at 40,000 tons, and we're carrying another 8,000 in cargo. If we survive a splashdown, then we'll sit on the bottom and watch the water come pouring in. Okay.
Sir, the course I've plotted maximizes our thrusters to put us at an angle. We'll definitely hit hard, but we should come to a rest near a shore. Hopefully not too deep so we can get out. Maybe even try to modify one of the mining surveyors to help us get out of here and to shore.
You're crazy.
Yes, sir. Crazy and not ready to die.
You got anything better?
Sharp turned, addressing the others that were gathered on the bridge. Nobody spoke, though Tarn was fidgeting. The captain swore and then shook his head.
I'll think about it. Until then, come up with something better.
Sharp left the bridge. Eric sent Jeff off to check on the engines. Tarn hunched over his station, ignoring the rest of them. Kira looked on until Eric let out a pent-up breath and turned to her.
You really think this is going to work?
She reached out from where she sat and took his hand in hers.
It's this or we drift through space forever. The odds of us coming close to another system are long, and even worse that it happens before we run out of time.
We could go into a cold sleep again.
Kira shook her head.
We could, but we'd need a few weeks of getting ourselves to full health, or we probably wouldn't survive it. Our food will only last so long.
The ship's got recycling systems.
Kira knew her sour expression conveyed her thoughts of eating anything recycled. Eric nodded in agreement.
Yeah, as if the powders aren't bad enough some days. Okay, so what are our odds?
She winked at him.
Depends on how the ship can handle the stress, and how good our engineer is. I think we've got the best engineer to be found outside of the core worlds, so I'm feeling pretty good about it.
Eric frowned.
Best engineer outside of the rim worlds, maybe, but that's because I may be one of the only ones dumb enough or unlucky enough to be out here.
Kira squeezed his hand.
Stop that. I'm learning a lot about myself these days, and it turns out I'm a lot tougher and a lot more capable than I ever thought I was. I know you are, too.
You're a special case.
She shrugged it off.
The computer gives us about a 1 in 10 chance of survival.
10%.
They both turned to Tarn, but he seemed too engrossed in whatever he was doing at his station to notice them.
You told the captain.
1 in 10 is if the computer handles everything, and we just enjoy the ride. Autopilot on the way in and everything. With me flying and you controlling the power, our odds are better.
From 1 in 10 to 1 in 3?
Yes, the computer can't override safety limits.
Eric snorted.
For good reasons.
The mule's never going to fly again.
She glanced around, feeling as though she was talking about the ship behind its back.
We just need the hull to remain sealed, the thrusters to be operational until we're out of fuel, and the inertial suppressor to work for one last kick. We can overload them when we need them to increase our odds. If it breaks them, oh well, we won't be needing them anymore.
Eric winced, but said nothing in response. Finally he nodded, and then glanced at Tarn again.
So we'll be stranded on an undiscovered planet that your sensors indicate supports life. Is there any life already on it?
Kira's hopeful smile faded.
Some. I mean there's oxygen, water, nitrogen, carbon, and other elements that result from living creatures. I can't pick up any evidence of electronic emissions or man-made elements.
Sounds too good to be true.
But it beats the alternative.
Okay, guess it's this or nothing. I'll see about rigging up the necessary overrides so I can run them remotely, rather than being stuck in the engine control room.
Kira shook her head.
We need the opposite.
The opposite?
Well, I assume. We need to all be in the safest place in the ship in case something happens in spite of all our plans.
Eric snapped his fingers.
Brilliant! If I reduce the coverage area of the inertial suppression field, I can increase the power of it far more effectively than covering the entire ship.
Kira grinned and kissed his hand.
I think I can handle being stuck on a remote tropical world with you.
It's tropical?
Kira grinned.
Heat and moisture readings show tropical climates for most of it, with temperate zones near the poles. Just think of it as a vacation. And I didn't pack my bathing suit.
Chapter 16.
A herd of 6 creatures, large enough to rout an elephant, was startled into a stampede by a crackling thunder overhead. A flash lit the sky brighter even than the sun, beginning with red and yellow flames until a darker shape emerged from it, streaking towards the ground below. Smaller fires burst free from it, giving proof to the unstable nature of the alien object. The largest piece slammed just off a recently abandoned shore, flash vaporizing the first water that came in direct contact with the superheated metal and sending the rest away in a surge that spread in all directions with the force of a tidal wave. Beating the tidal wave to the shore was the tremor as the Rented Mule slammed into the bedrock of the ocean. Creatures throughout the nearby forest howled and screeched, unprepared for the sudden tremors that threatened their footing and trembled the trees. A moment later, an unnatural quiet returned to the jungle. Birds had taken flight, but the animals that remained stared around in confusion. Some even dared to emerge from the edge of the jungle to the sandy beach and study the smoky trail through the sky that led to a growing wall of water. When the wave crested and broke against the beach, the uncomprehending creatures were swept away with the sand, water, and trees of the forest. The water slowly returned to the ocean or remained trapped in puddles and ponds. Small waves lapped at the shore, followed by another unnatural stillness. Cleared of any indigenous life forms, the machine that broke through the surface of the water several minutes later was greeted by nothing but silence. Water crested around it until it began to climb out of the water and onto the beach on wheels covered in metal treads. With less than a dozen feet to go, the treads bogged down in the soft sand and jammed up. After a few minutes of attempting to rock the vehicle back and forth to free it, the wheels proved too jammed with sand and mud to move. A hatch opened on the side, hissing as internal and external pressures equalized. Tarn stepped out, plasma rifle in hand, and a bandage across his head and leg. He climbed across the hull of the tracked mining vehicle and lowered himself carefully into the water. It was waist-high on him, allowing him to wade forward slowly, his rifle held at the ready. Captain Sharp followed, bandages around his midsection and bloodstains covering much of his clothing. Kira and Jeff came next, supporting Eric between them. The extensive bandages on the engineer gave proof to where much of the blood on Sharp's clothing had come from. They waded ashore, on their own or with the support of others, and all but collapsed on the beach. Eric glanced over, gasping for breath as he did so. Kira followed his gaze, tears running down her cheeks as she did so. A large serpentine fish flopped in a shallow puddle of water. As it gasped and extended its mouth, they saw the sharp row of teeth lining its jaw.
Tropical paradise.
Kira tried, and failed, to bite back a sob.
Sorry.
She shook her head and fought back the tightness in her throat.
No, it's all right. Just try to rest. We'll get you in the shade.
What shade?
Tarn called out from ahead.
Wave took out most of the trees, and them that's left got no leaves on 'em.
Then we've got building materials.
Kira snapped back. She looked around and gestured with the arm not holding on to Eric.
Gather up the broken twigs and limbs and we can make a lean-to.
Tarn stared at her, open mouthed. He turned to Sharp, ready to sputter a protest, when the captain nodded.
Do it. There's nothing around us for a ways, let's make shelter and rest up. Grab some of those fish and we can have a real dinner, too.
Jeff staring at the sharp teeth in the mouth of the nearby fish and asked,
Can we eat them?
If we can't eat what's here, we won't last long. Might as well find out sooner rather than later.
Kira grunted, signaling to Jeff, and they moved forward up the beach until they neared the first of the uprooted and broken trees that had been at the edge of the jungle. They gently lowered Eric to the ground.
Go help with the shelter.
Kira bade Eric's assistant. He nodded and hurried off, limping at his own twisted knee. None of them had escaped the crash unscathed. Kira had a nasty scrape across her back that had torn her shirt and skin, but it was minor in comparison to the slivers of metal that had speared through Eric's side when the inertial suppressor overloaded and exploded in front of him. His leg had been broken by a large piece of metal paneling, and his head gashed when he'd crashed to the floor. Kira pulled back his bandages at his side and stared at the torn flesh. The edges were raw and pink. She shook her head, terrified at what the lack of real medical attention would mean. A new world with new strains of bacteria and an open wound. Eric's time was limited, at best.
How is it?
The bleeding has stopped.
That was the only positive thing she could think to say. The water from the ocean had cleaned it some.
Rest will determine what happens next. The metal pieces were through and through, at least, and so hot from the explosion they were self-cauterizing.
Lucky me.
Kira faked a smile to keep herself from crying. After all she'd been through, discovering both herself and Eric, it wasn't fair that she should lose him now. Of all the people that had to be hurt, why couldn't it have been Tarn or Jeff or the captain? She glanced away, suddenly ashamed at herself for thinking that way. The captain and Jeff didn't deserve to be hurt, any more than Eric did. Tarn well. Jeff supervised the construction of the shelter, which quickly came to resemble a simple but spacious lean-to. Using the laser rifles, they started a fire and cooked up the fish. They found a few drowned or crushed animals amongst the fallen timbers as well, creatures that went unidentified. They left them alone, content to dine on the fish instead. The meal was simple but satisfying. They had no water to wash it down with, a problem that they only now realized. The ocean was far too salty to drink, another reminder of the human homeworld hundreds of light years away. The sun fell quickly, proving they'd crashed in the afternoon. With the setting sun came a sudden and surprising downpour from above.
All that water we kicked up when we crashed. Temperature dropped.
Gather it up. Use whatever we've got.
They looked around, scrambling to find anything they could to capture the rainwater. A loud crash from the darkness drew them up short.
What was that?
His answer came in the form of a loud roar that made their ears ring. They scrambled again, this time grabbing weapons and raising them to point into the waterlogged darkness.
Put the fire out.
No. Leave it. Tarn, stay here, I'll flank it.
Kira rose up, grimacing at the stiffness that had set into her back. Without waiting for a response, she slipped into the night, picking her way as best she could over the fallen timbers and spongy ground. She grunted in surprise when she stepped in a puddle that was deeper than she expected. Adding a fresh twist of her ankle and wrench in her hip, Kira struggled up to her knee and raised her scope to peer into the darkness. She flipped the imaging mode on it to thermal and saw a massive shape approaching. A crackle followed immediately behind a burst of light that streaked across the rainy landscape. Unlike laser and ion rifles, a plasma rifle fired a burst of energized matter that was visible to the human eye. It let off a bright light, displaying for a fraction of a second the two-legged beast that stood close to 20 feet tall. Additional bursts of plasma followed, lighting up the darkness as both the captain and Tarn opened up on the beast. Most of their blasts flew wide in the darkness, but a few hit home, causing additional roars of rage, but little in the way of actual damage. It spurred the creature on, bringing it towards them, closer and closer. The only thing saving them was the unfamiliar ground beneath the beast as it tripped and stumbled over the ruined landscape. Kira noted the range in her scope and fired when it was only 100 yards away. Assuming the monster had the same general physiology as every other mammal, she had aimed for its head. She had a quartering towards her shot, so she put the crosshair just behind the beast's right eye. The first shot rocked the beast's head to the left. It had stepped in a depression as she had fired, lowering it just enough that the .276 caliber teardrop glanced off the creature's forehead. It staggered from the impact, sidestepping several times to keep its feet, and then shook its gargantuan head and roared anew. More plasma bursts speared towards it, catching patches of its hide on fire. Kira stared calmly through her scope, noting additional heat spikes showing up as someone fired a laser rifle at the beast as well. Whatever the hide consisted of, it seemed highly resistant to energy weapons. Her rifle throbbed against her palm, letting her know the coils were ready. She stroked the trigger, making the contact that generated the magnetic pulse along the rails. This time, the round struck where she intended it, at a direct angle on the side of its head. It crashed to the ground, falling on its side and jerking its powerful legs several times before lying still. Kira rose up, stumbling as she did so. Fresh pain lanced through the leg she'd wrenched. Gritting her teeth, she limped over to the fallen monster and stared at it in the darkness. The fires on its hide had been put out by the rain, but she could see well enough in the darkness to see it was covered with a thick layer of short feathers. Tarn and Sharp joined her a moment later, swearing as they drew close enough to see it.
Where the hell are we?
I wonder if it tastes like chicken.
Kira turned away from it.
Doesn't matter. It came hunting, and we got in its way. We need to find a safe place as soon as we can and hole up. If we can eat the fish, we can eat the animals too. We need a source of fresh water and good hunting. Fruits too, or whatever this place has. We've got to give Eric a chance to get better, and then we'll be stronger and better able to find a permanent place to stay.
Permanent?
Jeff asked from the makeshift shelter they'd built.
We have to assume permanent.
Kira looked everywhere, but at her wounded lover.
If help comes, that's great, but until it does, we have to figure otherwise. We've got rechargers for the energy packs, and Eric made plenty of ammunition for my rifle before we landed. Means sleeping in shifts and everything.
Our paradise.
Eric said, and then grimaced as he pressed down on his side with his hand. Kira bit her lip and looked away.
I'll take first watch.
When if Eric died from his injuries, it would take some time. They had a day or two at least, she figured. A day or two before, she'd need strength she didn't know if she had. A day or two before, she'd need to see just how truly gone Emily really was.
This is the end of New Beginnings. Thank you for listening, and if you liked it, like it. Look out for Book 2 in the series, Vitalis, the Colony.